Now it's time for us to cross over to our Ocean for global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's time for Global Insight. The ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia entered its sixth week, even as talks are underway between the two sides to come to an agreement to end the fighting. The devastation on human lives and livelihoods is growing by the day, but many fear that Russian leader Vladimir Putin has no intention of calling it quits. We discussed the latest developments with Maya Cross, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University, and Christopher Hartwell, Professor at the ZHAW University of Management and Law in Zurich. Thank you both so much for joining us today. My first question to you, Professor Cross. Now, you've said that the war in Ukraine is likely to end in one of the three ways: a protracted Cold War, a possible World War III, or a nuclear war. Now, at this point, which of the scenarios looks most likely to you?
Right now, I would say it's actually headed more towards a protracted Cold War, and this would be perhaps the best outcome that we could foresee at the moment. I think the reason that it's looking more like that rather than a broader European or world war is because the Russian troops have really reached the limit of what they can do. They've had to retrench. We've seen them back down from trying to take Kyiv and topple the government. It seems that their goal now is more limited to eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region. And meanwhile, the sanctions are really hurting the Russian economy. So I think that the goals are more limited. But at the same time, the risk still exists that it could grow into something bigger. I think what worries me is that Putin may feel more desperate as he's not able to sort of chalk up the wins that he initially had intended. And if that's the case, there could be some kind of use of more powerful weapons. Another scenario is the risk of accident or miscalculation, where a missile from the Russian forces ends up crossing over into NATO territory. And if something like that happens, especially considering there's been a kind of decline in diplomatic interaction, there's less communication, particularly between the US and Russia, we could see this kind of misperception, miscalculation, which then grows into a broader war that brings NATO countries into it. And then we're talking about countries that have nuclear weapons, so nuclear powers in conflict with one another, potentially leading to World War III and a nuclear conflict. Still, at the moment, I think we are headed more into something that looks more like a protracted Cold War, though.
And Professor Hartwell, more than 300 people have been killed and tortured in Ghouta, according to reports, and the death toll is, of course, expected to be much higher once the entire city has been checked. And, well, the devastation seems to be growing and growing very terribly. And, well, do you think NATO is ever going to intervene in the Ukraine conflict at some point?
Well, I think what we see is the ante has been upped for NATO. It's going to be very, very difficult for NATO to sit on the sidelines now, given the atrocities that we've seen and the fact that these are only the tip of the iceberg, the fact that these are only the areas that the Ukrainian army has reclaimed. We don't know what's going on in Kherson. We don't know what's going on in Mariupol. We have pretty good sense now of what's going on. But whether or not this is some form of tripwire, some kind of red line, as former US President Barack Obama said, I don't think it's going to rise to that level for NATO, because the same issues are still there in terms of confronting a nuclear armed and possibly irrational actor. I think what we're going to see, perhaps we see it with the Czechs already, is more under the table arming of the Ukrainians. As I say, the Czechs are sending T-72 tanks. Perhaps the United States is in talks with Cyprus right now to send Soviet-era weaponry to Ukraine. Maybe we're going to see a stiffening of resolve, but I don't think we're going to see much more other than kind of expressions of condemnation, horrific actions, kicking Russia off the UN Human Rights Council. Again, more kind of symbolic actions. We will possibly see things that are happening again under the table, but we're not going to see anything overt for the reasons that Professor Cross already outlined.
And again, Professor Hartwell, well, the US has said that Russian President Putin is being misled by advisors who are, at this point, too scared to tell him the truth. Do you think that's true? And what do you think is really running through his mind?
Now, there's two things going on here. The first one is the old canard that if only Putin knew what was going on, he's being misled. He's not getting all the information. I'm sure he's a reasonable person if only he knew what was going on. We've been hearing this one from Kremlinologists forever, which is why I will not hazard a guess as to what is going on in Putin's mind. On the other hand, there is a small grain of truth to this, I would say, in the sense that Putin has actively eliminated opposition and other power poles within the Kremlin over the past 20 years. He's emasculated anyone else who's tried to step up to him, like Medvedev during his brief period as president. So I don't think he's actually getting all of the information. He's probably, he's definitely convinced of his own press. The hubris is there, as you could see from the strategy and the tactics of the Russian army going into Ukraine. He believed that this was going to be a 15-day war. He's not getting all the information he needs, probably because people are scared of feeding it to him, but it doesn't matter. He's still the commander-in-chief. He's still the executive. He's still the person who is making these decisions based on his own hubris and his own imperialistic ideology, so it doesn't matter.
And Professor Cross, do you think President Putin has any intention of ending this war at all, or signing and sticking to a peace deal? I mean, what do you think he wants to really get out of this first?
Well, I think he really has to be able to claim a win in some way. And by that, I mean both on the battlefield and geopolitically. So I think we have to remember that his key aim as the leader of Russia is to stay in power. He needs popular support to some degree at home to do this. But he's not going to voluntarily end the war unless he feels he can claim that he's won, so he can sell it at home and extend the reign of his power. The problem is at the moment, it's likely he can't truly win unless Ukraine is destroyed, in his view. And if we really look at what's gone on in the past few weeks, in many ways, he's already lost. So many of his decisions have really been self-defeating. He wanted to show strength, but instead he's revealed significant weaknesses in his power and in Russia's military power. We expected him to try to divide the West and to undermine liberal values, but in fact, the opposite has happened. The Western alliances have proven strong. There are ways in which everyone's speaking with one voice across the world, condemning what Putin has done in Ukraine. He wants to push Ukraine away from democracy and aspirations that lead it towards Western alliances. The opposite is happening. And he's not able to do basic things like stop the flow of weapons from the West into Ukraine, to stop the tens of thousands of Russian casualties. So in effect, he's found his country isolated. And in terms of peace talks, I think at this point, we can't really take the Russian delegation very seriously. Putin himself hasn't really become involved in the peace talks directly. There are two things on the table that he wants of Ukraine, two major things at least. One is that Ukraine will promise not to join NATO, so-called neutrality. And the other is that Ukraine should have to give up some of its territory to Russia. So he wants at least these two things, but the whole problem with this is that the Ukrainian people are fighting to stop this Russian invasion precisely because they're not willing to give up those two things. So hopefully, we won't see Ukraine effectively surrender to Russia despite all of the hardships and atrocities we're seeing at the moment.
And Professor Cross, there's been quite a lot of talk about Ukrainian neutrality, which seems like it will have to be part of whatever peace deal is reached by the two sides. But will that really bring peace? I mean, given Putin's lack of commitment to respecting past agreements on borders, what kind of security guarantee do you think Kyiv is really going to need?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And as we all know, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has actually offered neutrality at this point. But the thing is that it would only, even if it's accepted, it would only last for a very short period of time. Zelensky has said that in order to grant neutrality, Russian troops would first have to withdraw. So that would give some kind of window of peace. But right after that, I don't think that peace would hold. The Ukrainian people wouldn't accept it. For one thing, again, they've already died for self-determination and for sovereignty. Their cities and towns have been destroyed for it. So neutrality is really only in a short-term solution. And again, it represents a kind of surrender. But in order to make neutrality work, as you said, there has to be security guarantees. These security guarantees would necessitate other countries guaranteeing Ukrainian security for it, because part of the demand of Russia would be to demilitarize Ukraine, making it unable to participate in any foreign policy of its own or to protect itself. So what you have at the end would be something akin to a parallel form of Article 5, that an attack on Ukraine brings in other countries, probably NATO countries, again exposing this whole region to the possibility of a larger war, to World War III. And at the end of the day, I don't think you can trust Putin to stay committed to any kind of peace deal anyway. So I think if Ukraine actually gives in to this and agrees to neutrality, there is the possibility that Putin, instead of kind of backing down, will become emboldened to get a similar outcome with other countries to try to dominate them as well, particularly the Baltic countries.
And Professor Hartwell, at this point, it seems critical that the deaths and atrocities, devastation comes to a stop. And, well, how should a very quick peace deal then be rolled out?
I don't think there is a quick peace deal. I think Professor Cross said it exactly right. The Russians have proven themselves to be disingenuous when it comes to their negotiations. We've seen this time and again. The Russians utilize these peace talks, these ceasefires, in an attempt to kind of regroup and retrench, and then once again to negotiate in terms of offering demands and forcing other countries to do things from a position of strength. They're not getting anywhere when it comes to peace talks now, even with this idea of neutrality, which, of course, Ukraine was neutral in 2014 when Russia invaded the first time. There were security guarantees on the table from the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which they blitzed right through. So none of these things are going to happen again. I think with every step, and especially now the atrocities, now we know what is happening in Ruski Mir, in Russian world. We know what's happening behind the curtain in the occupied territories in Ukraine, that there is no quick peace deal. There is only victory. And it is only people who are outside of the war zone or who are on the Russian side who are talking about peace deals. The Ukrainians themselves are talking about victory when we win this war.
What are your thoughts on this, Professor Cross? I mean, the human cost of this war is simply unbearable. Is there a best or fast way to end it? I mean, what kind of developments are you hoping to see in this regard?
Well, it's a really tough one, because essentially the war likely has to end in order to stop this human cost. And as we've seen, and as Professor Hartwell already mentioned, Ukrainians are fighting for victory here. They've already made a lot of sacrifices. And so they're bearing the human cost of it. I think the EU should continue to have an open door to refugees, but there has to be a recognition globally that there's a limit to what the EU can do in this respect, especially with such an unprecedented fast flow of refugees in a short period of time. Other countries should take more refugees. Hopefully there's a way to negotiate more reliable humanitarian corridors so people can get to safety. But again, the best way to stop the human cost is to end the war itself. And I think the West is doing what it can. It has to continue to ratchet up the sanctions at their fullest to start really sanctioning energy, because otherwise money keeps flowing into Russia. There has to be an increase in the transfer of weapons to Ukraine. The Western alliances have to hold strong. The world has to speak with one voice in condemning what's going on there. And hopefully that will eventually bring an end to the war.
That was Maya Cross, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University, and Christopher Hartwell, Professor at Saul School of Management and Law. Thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.